The Honourable Simon Power.
Mr Speaker, I wish to make a ministerial statement under Standing Order 347 relating to New Zealand's endorsement of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Honourable Simon Power.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I seek leave for members to be allowed a slight and reasonable extension on their contributions beyond the 5 minutes envisaged in standing orders if so required.
Is there any objection to that course being followed? There is none. Honourable Simon Power.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, this morning at 4:45 a.m. New Zealand time, 12:45 p.m. New York time, the Minister of Māori Affairs, the Honourable Dr Peter Sharples, appeared before the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and announced New Zealand's support for the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as follows. Hei te tine, hei te mano, ero rangatira mā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. In September 2007, at the United Nations, 143 countries voted in favour of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. New Zealand was one of 4 countries that voted against that declaration. Today, New Zealand changes its position. We are pleased to express our support for the Declaration. In keeping with our strong commitment to human rights and Indigenous rights in particular, New Zealand now adds its support to the Declaration both as an affirmation of fundamental rights and in its expression of new and widely supported aspirations. Māori hold a distinct and special status as the Indigenous people or tangata whenua of New Zealand. Indigenous rights and Indigenous culture are of profound importance to New Zealand and fundamental to our identity as a nation. A unique feature of our constitutional arrangements is the Treaty of Waitangi, signed by representatives of the Crown and Māori in 1840. It is a founding document of New Zealand and marks the beginning of our rich cultural heritage. The treaty establishes a foundation of partnership, mutual respect, cooperation and good faith between Māori and the Crown. It holds great importance in our laws, our constitutional arrangements and the work of successive governments. The Declaration contains principles that are consistent with the duties and principles inherent in the treaty, such as operating in the spirit of partnership and mutual respect. We affirm this objective and affirm the government's commitment to build and maintain constructive relationships with Māori to achieve better results for Māori, which will benefit New Zealand as a whole. The Declaration is an historic achievement, the result of many years of discussions, 22 in fact, and of hard work and perseverance by many people. I acknowledge the long involvement of Māori in the elaboration of the Declaration and the extent of their investment in its development. The Declaration acknowledges the distinctive and important status of Indigenous peoples, their common historical experiences and the universal spirit that underpins its text. The Declaration is an affirmation of accepted international human rights and also expresses new and non-binding aspirations. In moving to support the Declaration, New Zealand both affirms those rights and reaffirms the legal and constitutional frameworks that underpin New Zealand's legal system. Those existing frameworks, while they will continue to evolve in accordance with New Zealand's domestic circumstances, define the bounds of New Zealand's engagement with the aspirational elements of the Declaration. In particular, where the Declaration sets out aspirations for rights to and restitution of traditionally held land and resources, New Zealand has, through its well-established processes for resolving treaty claims, developed its own distinct approach. That approach respects the important relationship Māori as tangata whenua have with their lands and resources, both currently and historically, and the complementary principles of rangatiratanga and kaitiakatanga that underpin that relationship. It also maintains and will continue to maintain the existing legal regimes for the ownership and management of land and natural resources. New Zealand acknowledges and understands the historic injustices suffered by Māori in relation to their land and resources and is committed to addressing these through the established treaty settlement process. Many Māori groups have already benefited from the transfer of considerable land, forest and fishery assets through negotiated treaty settlements. Many more are in the process of negotiations with the government towards settling their claims. These settlements contribute to the re-establishment of an economic base as a platform for future development. Redress offered in treaty settlements is, however, constrained by the need to be fair to everyone and by what the country as a whole can afford to pay. Further, where the Declaration sets out principles for Indigenous involvement in decision-making, New Zealand has developed and will continue to rely upon its own distinct processes and institutions that afford opportunities to Māori for such involvement. These range from broad guarantees of participation and consultation to particular instances in which a requirement of consent is appropriate. In those processes and institutions, we acknowledge that our ongoing national dialogue is grounded in the Treaty of Waitangi. We further recognise that Māori have an interest in all policy and legislative matters and acknowledge the determination of Māori that custom, worldviews and cultural heritage should be reflected in the laws and policies of New Zealand. Māori have been and continue to be active in developing innovative responses to issues with a strong Indigenous perspective and engaging with successive governments on possible paths forward. We will continue that conversation within the relationship that the treaty and New Zealand's constitution as a whole affords. Further, we will continue to work in international fora to promote the human rights of Indigenous peoples. New Zealand acknowledges the ongoing process of dialogue and debate over the meanings that may be given to the aspirations put forward by the Declaration. New Zealand's support for the Declaration represents an opportunity to acknowledge and restate the special cultural and historical position of Māori as the original inhabitants, the tangata whenua of New Zealand. It reflects our continuing endeavours to work together to find solutions and underlines the importance of the relationship between Māori and the Crown under the Treaty of Waitangi. Its affirmation of long-standing rights supports and safeguards that ongoing relationship, and its proclamation of new aspirations gives us all encouragement and inspiration for the future. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Order. Honourable members, before I call the next member, I perhaps should give members guidance as to how I intend to interpret the leave granted by the House. The government, the Minister, took 2 minutes extra to the norm in making his address to the House. I proposed that the parties would normally have 5 minutes should have up to 7 minutes should they choose, and the parties that would normally have 2 minutes should have up to 3 minutes should they choose to use it. The Honourable Nanaia Mahuta.